And we are live. Welcome back to the Placemakers. We are doing it again. It is my favorite time of the week. It's that time when I get to hang out with my friends who are much cooler and smarter than your friends to talk about the future of higher education. Thank you for joining us. This week, we are talking all about hospitality. Our Placemakers are David, Tim, and Venny. Thank you for joining me this week. We'll start off just by saying cheers to all three of you. Cheers to our viewers. Anyone joining us live. I want to jump right in. Hospitality, higher education has been devastated by this whole thing, this pandemic. And I think it's been devastated because both industries are similar in that we are built around this notion of bringing people together. And this pandemic has torn that whole idea apart. Knowing that these two industries sort of work in concert with each other in many ways, and that we have been devastated. And higher education particularly is trying to find that new normal. Is that the same for hospitality? Is there going to be a new normal in hospitality, or are we just going to slowly work our way back into what we've always done? Just sort of right off the top.
I'll jump in.
Tim, that's heavy. I know.
Yeah, I think near term, we've got to make some major adjustments.
Yeah.
I think longer term, hopefully inside of 2 years from now, the way that we gather and experience and enjoy hospitality settings will be really similar to what we've been doing. And maybe that's the optimist in me, but I think right now we're just drenched in recency bias working through this. There's a lot of uncertainty whether we can have herd immunity or a vaccine. Either of those happening is pretty crucial, but I just feel like right now the thought of being around people, touching surfaces, sharing spaces is obviously alarming for all the right reasons, but it's in our nature. We want to gather, especially in university communities. I mean, the ethos of our brand and why we get out of bed every day is that we're here to serve people who want to gather and connect and have weddings and cocktails and all that.
Do we think gathering might look a little different though? One of the things we keep hearing on this show is people talking about sort of a new form of gathering. And maybe that's just in the higher ed sphere. The gathering might take place in smaller groups, face-to-face, and in larger groups virtually. Does any of that translate over to hospitality? Or is it only translating potentially in where there's a marriage between hospitality and the higher ed industry on campuses?
We're wondering the same things. I mean, on the hotel side, there are way more questions than answers right now. I'd love to hear Benny, what you're seeing on the campus side.
I would say short term, there is the broad spectrum. There are people who would love for us to get back to a normal. And there are the other side of the spectrum that is really, really concerned about the science because it's something we just don't understand. This is a novel virus, and we're still trying to figure out what does it mean and how contagious it is and what's the science about it. Yet at the same time, we're all social beings, and there's this need for connecting that's critically important. And so higher education's been around for 500 years. It's all based on in-person interaction between that teacher and the group of students. And what we're seeing as a part of this is that students who have gone online crave for that in-person experience. And so the question for us is, how do you do that safely in a time and space where there isn't a vaccine, there's not enough testing, and what does social tracking mean, and what happens with other folks? So my sense of it is that students want to congregate in a way and connect in a way, and for about the first, say, 9 months, we're going to try to do that in the safest, most hygienic way as possible. And then as science sort of catches up with the virus, I believe we'll start to see that open up. And once we get a sense of confidence in how we respond to this pandemic.
Venny, one of the things, I had this conversation today with somebody that everybody feels like they're waiting for guidance, right? Everybody's waiting for official guidance, whether that comes from the CDC or from the government or whomever it may be. And it feels like there's this sort of two stories going on. One is get guidance and strictly adhere to guidance, or make a statement blaze a trail and say, this is what we're going to do as an institution. And that seems to sort of point to this idea that you brought up the other day that I thought was really profound, this notion of sort of psychological safety. And so how much of this is about us going out and making statements and creating psychological safety in our environments, and how much of it is about the science and the guidance?
Well, I think it's about both. And the campuses that have come out and said, we don't know, we're developing multiple scenarios, from online to in-person, everything in between, and then it's based on a sense of principles, right? So as a parent, I sort of put myself as a parent. My daughter's in graduate school at Chapman, and give a shout out to Gab, she's listening. But I think as a parent, what I want to know is, do you have the procedures in place to respond? Give me a level of confidence. And that's that psychological safety. I want to know there's a level of confidence in it, that if an outbreak happens in a particular location, that you have these things, these steps in place, that you're doing what you can to keep up hygiene in the space, that you're doing what you can in terms of serving students and food, and you're doing what you can to provide different modes of education. So that gives me that sort of psychological comfort that I could place, that I'm going to put my faith in my child being at this institution.
Yeah, and we've seen articles that talk about enrollment decisions are going to be made based on parents and students' sort of confidence in that, right? That's going to be really, really important. And then we saw the data that came out, actually, Vinny, that you had sent about, we're projecting a huge enrollment decline, and part of that is about communication, is about getting on the same page, and how that's a little bit different than what higher ed has done over time. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the whole campus and the entirety of campus from a hospitality perspective, and even just from a campus building perspective. One of the things we've heard time and again on this show is about breaking down silos, right? And about the future of higher education is going to call for us to work a little bit differently across units, and to be less of fiefdoms. It's saying, this is mine, and not worrying about the other things. What does that mean for hospitality? What does that mean as we look at hotels on campus, or we look at restaurants on campus, or we look at auxiliaries and revenue generators on campus? Does that shift the relationship of those things, whether it be to the entire campus or to certain entities on campus?
Oh, is that to me, Dave?
It could be to anybody. It could be to anybody. Jump in, whomever. But
Well,
if Vinny doesn't want to answer it, we got that. David, go.
Yeah. No. TJ, I'll sort of put it out there and let David, as the architect, sort of look at it. I think that shift started happening a long time ago, at least 5 to 10 years ago. I can remember a time in my career where if a faculty member or staff would walk into a residential dining location, it was an anomaly. They were there because they were invited into that space. And I think what we've sort of seen over the last 10 years, at least with the architects, we've worked with David's firm, Perkins and Wells, on a project, and other firms. And there's the talk about placemaking with space, and that space now isn't just one particular thing, right? It's not just dining, but it's a place of community. It's a place where people come and gather, they meet, they do various different things. And I think you sort of see that. There's a place called the Milk Market in Detroit, not in Detroit, I'm sorry, in Denver, that has a combined hotel. It's got what you see in a residence hall in terms of food, in an office building, all built into one. And it's a very dynamic space. It's right next to Core Stadium. And so when you go there, you sort of see that placemaking that sort of happens among that group. And so in my thinking, COVID-19 may push that even further in terms of what all these spaces are. But I think David probably can give a more articulate view of that.
Well, I'll try, Vinny, but I think you're right in that the idea of de-siloing has been on the cusp for a long time, and this will push it through. As planners and designers on campuses, and also with hospitality, one thing we think is really rich about a campus is when it is de-siloed when it comes to building typologies. The old school way of having one building be for schools, by practices, by different professional colleges on campuses, even student unions. When they're siloed, you lose that cross-pollination that really makes a culture and also kind of drives cities. I think one way to think about campuses as a city, if you will, kind of also kind of living above the garage, which is a really rich idea of having kind of housing or different things populated above the workspace, above the play space, above the retail. So having COVID happen, I think, with all the financial challenges that we're all facing, is going to push that de-siloing happen as a natural outcome. I think, TJ, one of your episodes actually talked about this as well. I think we've all heard this through the last month of discussions. So I guess in the context of how hospitality wraps into this, if we're thinking about more de-siloing, thinking about more mixed use properties on campus, if you will, when you come out of this, how does hospitality and the fact that you have mixed use, we have kind of mixed use through that, play into that campus fabric?
Yeah, and I don't disagree that this de-siloing, if that's a word that we just made up that we're going to go with, if that de-siloing has begun to happen in higher education, and I think it's happened in sort of from a design perspective. I still wonder if it's happened from a financial perspective. Oftentimes, you look at the way that projects are funded, the way RFPs are issued, and I tend to agree with you, David. I think that that COVID is going to expedite a lot of the paradigm shifts in higher education, that being one of them, that you can no longer look through a single lens and say, this building is the one we're going to focus on for this one single use. I think we're going to be looking at multiple uses for facilities and as funding across the entire institution potentially. And I mean, Michigan State might be an outlier, Purdue might be an outlier. There are some big institutions that have the endowment or can continue to work, the way that they've worked traditionally. But I think most of the folks in the middle of the bell curve are going to have to shift a little bit and think a little bit differently.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think that shift will have to happen, and each campus or each kind of typology, if you will, but big publics, small privates, they're each going to deal with it differently.
Yeah.
We've seen the pendulum swing in general the last decade. We've also seen it swing through the lens of P3 as well, as kind of one way to bring more of that mixed use on campus, right?
So one of the things I think Tim probably thinks an awful lot about, and I know I've heard Venny talk about this, is this notion of brand and building a brand and brand loyalty. And I wonder, what is the place of brand loyalty now as higher education is on some pretty rocky sort of turf? Is it going to be increasingly important to differentiate as a campus as we look toward relevance?
I'll jump in and say yes, absolutely. Because I mean, you've already seen it with different campuses kind of angling for an edge, either in cost, competitiveness, online. We can do it better than you can. So absolutely. I think as it relates maybe to hospitality, the four of us travel a lot, right? And so we're all probably have our favorite brands of where to stay. Yeah. And that's going to even increase going forward. If you're going to be, first of all, would you travel? You need to travel to do business. We're doing this remotely right now. So
yeah, we're learning a lot about the nature of work, right? Yeah.
Right. So if you do travel, you'll likely, maybe in the next 6 months, stay with your brands because you may trust them more. Just kind of thinking as a visitor to properties.
Yeah. Well, Tim, in terms of like brand differentiation, like right now, and I don't want to generalize, but Starbucks is a Starbucks is a Starbucks. If I've got a brand on a campus that is working hard to differentiate itself to remain relevant, is it going to be important for national brands to start to look at ways to sort of carve out a niche within a campus community, or is it more important to have an overall brand alignment across the entire portfolio nationally or internationally?
That's a great question, something we think about a lot. I think we see, certainly as we grow, the bigger we get, the smaller we want to think, so that we don't ever drift away from what is the heart and soul of every community we serve with every hotel. What are those stories? What are those traditions and quirks, and who are those characters that we need to shine a light on and really celebrate and share with the world? So as we scale graduate, we cannot be in any way kind of formulaic about, there's just nothing cookie cutter about what we do. So that's inherent to our particular mission. So we can never really drift far away from really thinking small and being hyper local. Bigger brands, I think, are starting to see that, folks really want experiential. Your hotel points don't matter as much as your richness of experience. And so they want to at least position their brands to seem more local, even if it's just one or two features and not a full deep dive. So I'm actually curious about the loyalty aspect with some of the bigger brands. Hilton, Marriott, and others are trying to get in front of this now and create that psychological safety we talk about by stressing new cleaning protocols and keyless entry features that have existed for years, but they're pretending, maybe are new, or they're just for the first time deciding to plug these aspects of their business into their marketing platform to improve their relationship with consumers. But overall, I still think people are going to thrive on rich experiences. It's a trend we've been seeing for a long time, and obviously we're hopeful it will continue because I think more and more you can come home with 3,000 Marriott points staying in a Courtyard after 3 nights in Pittsburgh, or you can walk away and say, oh my gosh, I felt like I lived there for a while, and I'm connected with that place, and I'm going to take some ownership of that, and I've made a connection, and I'm eager to come back. And so I'm hopeful that doesn't fade in the eyes of travelers and consumers. And again, I think it's just going to take time for this comfort level to return.
Yeah. Vanny, what do you think about brand from the campus lens? You've been huge on building out brand alignment at Michigan State and the Live On brand. And, how does that change in the wake of this, or does it?
I think Tim was right in that the student experience is key. And you feel that level of affinity to your brand. And I think across the country, there are 3,000 universities. There's one for everyone. And so the Ivy League has a brand. What I would call the public Ivies, that being North Carolina, Michigan, University of Washington.
You can throw Florida in there. We'll take it.
Yeah, you have Florida. I mean, they have a Texas. They have a brand. And you know what that means. And when that brand is disconnected with the experience is when everyone gets in trouble. And so, that becomes something that's very critical.
Yeah, and you say, there's a university out there for everyone, and I agree with that. I at its core, I think that's what makes higher education so magical is, as an incoming student, you get this opportunity to determine this is where I fit. Right. But I don't know that institutions have done the best job of differentiating themselves from each other. We've talked a lot about the bell curve on this show, and the notion that, over here are super dynamic, small, nimble schools, and over here are the powerhouses, which are the ones you just mentioned. And then there's a whole lot of people in the middle that are just all shooting at the same target. And that target's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as the enrollment cliff falls off. And so I wonder if it's going to be more important for everybody in the middle to start to think about, as an example, do I need to work hard to educate every 18 to 24-year-old? Or an article just came out today in Forbes about differentiation from an enrollment perspective and looking at a workforce returning to work who has a lot of kids and less time and less money. Should we be targeting skills development in short-term credentialing classes and things like that more often? Should we really be shifting that model?
Yeah, I think what you'll see in higher education is right. So there's a consortium of schools in Boston, David, you probably know them, who share a common platform, but they're different. So if I want a liberal arts degree, but I need some sciences, I go to this campus, and I'm here, and I think you're going to start to see some of that. I think you're going to start to see some of the things that Georgia Tech has done, where they'll partner with AT&T and provide some specific credentialing programs. You may see some institutions in architect firms that will partner with each other to provide certain types of learning credentialing. I was in a P3 conference several years ago in DC, and one of the things that I thought was fascinating is that how much we will need to have credentialing around data management, AI, and machine learning. That will impact everybody's work. So whether you're in architecture or in the hospitality industry, but you need to have some level of credentials. So schools that are able to be flexible to, put a program out like that really quickly will differentiate themselves in the marketplace.
Go ahead, David. I was going
And
to
I
ask
think,
you about design too, but go ahead.
yeah, just a quick comment, Vinny. I think the consortiums you mentioned, I think what they do recognize that we should start to think about post-COVID is sharing those resources you may not need on campus, but your students need to have as an asset. So I think the ability for different colleges in that context you mentioned to kind of tap into that rather than
Mhm.
kind of replicating services is really ties into de-siloing as well. It's all about kind of sharing and kind of mixing the uses and the experience so the student gets the best experience possible in
Well,
their context.
and when you talk about mixed uses, it makes me think about some of the projects you've done where, you've really been at the forefront of looking at multi-use facilities, looking at building buildings that serve a variety of purposes, and also retrofitting those buildings and other buildings to have multiple uses. What do you think the future is going to be more about adjusting our current architecture, or what we do moving forward with architecture from a design perspective to make it fit multiple uses, if indeed that paradigm is important?
I think it's the latter. I think it's
Yeah.
taking what we have and applying it. I think there's one thought I wanted to share. Listening to the first episode where Jim Curtin talked about the new unit.
Yeah.
It's also been referred to as social bubbles. Hopkins is researching it, Oxford's researching it as far as what is a social bubble or a new unit. And if you didn't hear the first episode, it's basically saying we're all quarantining with different sizes of communities. And if you go back
Right.
to campus, if you think about for the res life scale, can we agree that 15, 20 people is a social bubble or a new unit? To answer your question about mixed uses, what if they also take the same class in that same building? And so
Yeah.
you basically are kind of creating, kind of isolating that one compartment, if you will. So in much the same way that hospitality has these kind of meeting spaces, these assembly spaces in them, they kind of work the same way, right?
Yeah. Well, and so you're now talking about unconventional use of space as well, looking at a residence hall
Correct.
that exists and putting a
Correct.
classroom in there. And I could even extend
Correct.
that beyond the walls of campus. I could look at somebody like Tim and say, you know what, now we got to de-densify residence halls. How do we use hotel accommodations? How do we use the lobby of your hotel as a classroom? How are we going to spread all this out to include our partners around the boundary of campus as well?
Yeah, and I think these ideas about that are evolving post-COVID, whether it's classrooms in the building or even having your washrooms not being shared by 30 people, having more compartmentalized, those are trends we've already seen.
Yeah.
As far as having living learning communities be a bit more kind of right-sized. So I
Yeah.
think it's really kind of fast-forwarding that process.
Well, and the reason I think it's critical to normalize some of this is the other thing we heard. Sarah Russell articulated this so well. She said, it is not viable for higher education to shut down every time something like this happens. Right. So we've got to get to a place where we've put a model whereby we can survive some of these things a little bit better than we have this time around. And part of that is normalizing these partnerships and lack of silos and thinking creatively about the use of the whole campus, whether that be the unit size or use of space. I want to turn a little bit of a corner and ask about opportunities. I never want to let a good crisis go to waste. What opportunities does this pandemic sort of give us and teach us moving forward in terms of how we're going to engage hospitality on our campuses?
Boy,
I
I'll,
know
I'll,
it's hard to think. I mean, I'm sure that. Go ahead, David.
I'll jump in. Why not? So
Then
one
he had a
thing.
sigh there. He doesn't see any opportunities.
So one thing we've been kind of thinking about with the leadership group in my office in student life is what is the future of student life or of higher education. So if we think about it in the context of hospitality, the future might be not that students apply, but they subscribe to campus. So think about it, Radisson, Marriott, you really kind of subscribe to that program with your loyalty points. What it could mean is that, just thinking out loud, right? And so this could push these things forward, that it's kind of encouraging the lifelong experience. So you're really like selling a brand of a campus to get them back on campus, but also thinking about the lifelong experience. Secondly, what if we think about just kind of it as a subscription model going forward to kind of drive interest, and it's also a global experience as well.
Yeah.
So just trying to tie a possibility on campuses to kind of how hospitality relates right now could be one way to kind of think about an opportunity in higher ed.
I love that thought. I'll send you the link to the Forbes article from today. It will speak to you based on just that premise alone.
Cool.
Tim, what do you think? Opportunities? Do we have any?
Yeah, absolutely. I think right now we have an opportunity to just get a lot smarter about our standards of how facilities are kept and maintained. Going forward, what materials are used or avoided to help provide a more safe environment and one that is less vulnerable to an outbreak like this. So I think those are some interesting takeaways. I think some new standards and best practices will be implemented, certainly in the hotel and food and beverage operations world, that will probably remain adopted going forward. Given the lack of clarity, Vinny said it well that science hasn't really caught up to this virus yet. It'll take a little time, but I think the industry is going to need something from governmental regulation standpoint to serve as a guide for what is recommended or required, because a lot of ideas that are being thrown around right now are kind of in competition with one another, which is good. We should be throwing everything on the table and seeing what works. But we kind of probably need some framework of general guidance and acceptability, and then need to communicate that to the traveling public so that they can feel better knowing that the CDC and other appropriate bodies have kind of weighed in and endorsed these approaches, and then the brands can be there to say, hey, we operate in compliance with these recommended guidelines, and we do X, Y, Z differently. So those are opportunities, but they're also, I think, just by virtue of becoming necessary, they're going to be requirements if you want to survive.
Yeah, it's one thing I've noticed is that shifts in the way that we work as a culture have forced change, obviously on the retail industry, right? You look at big box, you look at how it's impacted front of house versus back of house, even in some of these fast casual opportunities. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, this pandemic is going to force structural change, and it'll be interesting to see what sticks around and what doesn't stick around from a structural change perspective.
Absolutely. Another one I think of a lot because it applies to a campus-like setting. This explosive growth over the last decade of an open workspace, really cramming more people into smaller square footages. And now we've got to work kind of with the opposite priorities in mind, and with platforms like Zoom helping businesses realize that many of them can, operate at least 95% capacity. How do we rethink what type of real estate we even actually need, and how does that look on a campus?
And Peter over at Workshop said, this could be the death of the open office format, and it's really interesting how disease and health has formatively informed design, and how we can watch trends get reversed like that overnight, and we may never see it return. It's very, very interesting. Venny, what are the opportunities? Is there anything good coming out of this?
Yeah, I think there actually is a lot of good things. So if you look at the food and beverage industry as an example, there was the location that you did takeout, and there was your in-person restaurant. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're going to start to see is those two things melt together, and the folks in food and beverages that can do takeout really well and really inexpensively will and then use technology to be able to access that are going to ones that are going to thrive again, and who can be asynchronous. All right, so you can do that almost so that both experience are equal. Both the in-restaurant and the takeout restaurant experience is the same. I think the other thing we're going to start to see is the workplace will be part-time. Mm. So there'll be times in which you're at home, and there'll be times in which you're in the office, because the collisions still need to happen. Those things need to happen, and in-person meetings need to happen. But there isn't necessarily the reason for me to be there every day in some roles. So I think that's what's going to happen. So there's going to be this hybrid sort of world that we're going to be living in, that is, who does the third place really well, right? I mean, if you sort of think about Starbucks, the coffee is a coffee is a coffee. It's the third place that is what they do really well. And so that's going to be the opportunity, I think, that this has showed us, that we need to figure out how the third place sets within this group that meets all the hygiene goals, it meets all the community goals, and that's all the safe goals. And so I think those are the opportunities, TJ.
Well, you're hitting on so many of the things that we have to dig so much deeper into, and that's why we're going to continue to do this podcast. For now, I'll say what I always say, which is that no podcast is good after 30 minutes. I want to thank everybody for jumping in with us and hanging out with me at my favorite time of the week when I get to hang out with my friends who are cooler and smarter than your friends. For now, tune in on us next week when we attack another topic. Thank you guys so much. Guys, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thanks.
DJ.
And we'll wait a
Thanks,
second.
EJ.